Welcome, everyone. Let's begin the second virtual salon, Armenian communities in the Middle East today. Our focus today is Syria and Iran. I am Huri Berberian, Professor of History, Meroni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies, and Director of the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of California, Irvine. On behalf of the Center for Armenian Studies, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar and to this series, which is a timely and thought-provoking intervention during a tense time, continuing tense time, both in Armenia and the diaspora. And by focusing on the Armenian communities, broader questions regarding diaspora, minority politics, migration, and more will be examined during this series. The third part of our series will take place on April 23rd, which is also a Friday at the same time, 12 o'clock Pacific time. And it will be on the Armenian community in Turkey. But before that, on March 11th, we will be hosting a webinar on Armenia, on Armenia's current political turmoil at 10 p.m. Pacific time on March 11th. We will have a panel discussion on Armenia's velvet voice and vision in an uncertain world. We hope you will join us for both events. But now to our webinar today. A few words of thanks. This webinar is part of the Vahe and Armine Meruni lecture series. We'd like to thank the Merunis, our donors and supporters, and also our co-sponsors, the UCI History Department and UCI Global Middle East Studies. Of course, a very big thank you to our panelists from across the world, joining us from Armenia, the Netherlands, Italy, Australia, and the US. Especially thank you to Tsoli Nalbantian, who helped with the initial thinking and planning of the virtual salon, and I will thank her at each part of the series, even though she is modest about it. Thanks also to Dwayne Pack and Saeed Jalalipur for their behind the scenes work as always. And I may forget to thank them sometimes, but they are always a very important part of what we do here. So the webinar will proceed in the following way. I will introduce our moderator, Dr. Chris Sheklian, for this session. He will introduce Doctors Marisa de la Gatta, Harout Ekmanian, and James Bari in the opposite order. Well, sort of, but anyway, who will make a 10 to 12 minute presentations each. And then Dr. Sheklian will moderate a discussion among the presenters and the panelists. And then we will open up the virtual floor to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions. Please make your questions clear and concise, and we thank you in advance for doing that. But before I introduce Dr. Sheklian, let me quickly introduce or briefly mention the panelists so that you will know the ones who will not be introduced in great detail by Dr. Sheklian. They are the panelists joining us, and I want to thank them for joining us today, are of course James Bari, Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute, and maybe you can sort of wave, of course they can see your name, but still. Marisa de la Gatta, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at the University of Bari. Harout Ekmanian, international lawyer and attorney in New York. Tsoli Nalbantian, Assistant Professor of Modern Middle East History at Leiden University. Joan Randanucho, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Pomona College. Harout Papazian, Lecturer at the American University of Armenia. And Dr. Sheklian is a postdoctoral researcher in the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion, and is part of the European Research Council's Rewriting Global Orthodoxy at Radboud University in the Netherlands. I'm sorry if I mangled that. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago with his dissertation, Theology and the Community, the Armenian Minority, Tradition, and Secularism in Turkey. Previously, Dr. Sheklian has been a Manoukian postdoctoral fellow in Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan, visiting assistant professor at Wesleyan University. He was also director of the Krikor and Clara Zohrab Information Center at the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America. He has published work on liturgy and law in the lives of religious minorities, and I will now hand over the reins to him. Thank you all to the panelists. Thank you to the attendees for being here with us. Chris?
Thank you, Huri. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I would say that I'm still getting a handle on Dutch vowels, so I have no idea how to pronounce most of my own titles and places yet. So yeah, thank you. I'm really thrilled to get to moderate this panel, the second in our series of virtual salons. So you'll see me again as an actual panelist talking about Turkey next time. But this one here in the middle, I think is really exciting because it's going to bring together not only scholars really worldwide, but also we'll be talking both about Iran and Syria today. I guess I can't say evening because we're again all over the world. As I told our panelists when we were preparing, in a way we have a bit of a challenge because unlike the other two that are more situated on one single country, we also have both the challenge and the opportunity today to think about comparisons a little bit with Iran and Syria. Obviously, we've been doing this and will do this because all of our panelists are from different places of expertise, but explicitly on our panel, we have both Iran and Syria under question today. So with that in mind, we're going to start by hearing from Dr. James Bari, who will tell us a little bit about Iran and the Armenian community there, and then we'll sort of move into the other two scholars who are going to tell us about Syria. So without any further ado there, let me introduce Dr. Bari in a little more detail. Dr. James Bari is a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University. He's an anthropologist specializing in ethnic and religious identity in Iran. His book, Armenian Christians in Iran, was published by Cambridge University Press. His research interests center on the interrelationship between language, ethnicity, religion and nationalism, and diaspora and transnationalism. He's published research in ethnic and racial studies, Third World Quarterly, Iranian Studies, and the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Huri. Thank you, everyone who's been behind organizing this, or as they say in Iran, Tzedeket Chitsava. It's one of the things that I focus on is identity in Iran, particularly amongst Armenians. And one of the constant tensions, of course, is between the mainstream Iranian identity and maintaining an Armenian identity. But one of the aspects which really shows the absorption of both is the use of ta'aruf being this form of courtesy or politeness in Iran, and the direct translation of Persian phrases into English, like Tzedeket Chitsava, may your hand not hurt, which is a way of saying thank you in Persian, Dasta dar nakone. Similarly, the way of saying to somebody who you're about to take some of their time, in Persian you say Khaste naboshid, or in Armenian you say Hoknats chilinek, please don't be tired, or don't be tired. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of Iranian Armenians in Iran specifically, but most of what I want to really talk about is the current problems there, the rise in ethnic tension, and how this is affecting the Armenian community, which is now quite a small community, perhaps from 150,000 in 1979. Some people estimate more than that, 250,000, to maybe less than 20,000 today. Particularly in the last 20 years, it's really declined. So to start with, just to give you a general background, because I work on contemporary communities, sometimes I do get criticism that I don't look at the great contributions of Iranian Armenians. I look more at the contemporary community. So just to give a bit of background, the community in Iran is quite old. Most of you would know the division between what is the Persian sphere and what is the Armenian sphere is not easy to look at. There's no real boundary in antiquity. There's no clear boundary, sorry, in antiquity. parts of Iran are part of historically what was called Persian Armenia, particularly Khoy in West Azerbaijan province, around that area. But of course, most people in this space associate the Iranian Armenian community with the deportations of Shah Abbas in the early 17th century and the movement of large numbers of Armenians and other people into Iran during the Ottoman Safavid Wars. This, of course, forms the core narrative around Iranian Armenians today and their origins, particularly in terms of the achievements that the communities had, and of course, New Jolfa in Isfahan being a center of that identity, and the churches and artwork of New Jolfa, as well as the economic contributions. But of course, many Iranian Armenians will tell you that they have other origins, either more recent or more ancient than that. So those who come from Azerbaijan province will tell you that they are not Shah Abbas Armenians. Similarly, you get people whose families came from Tbilisi or from what is now modern Armenia in more recent times. But by recent, I mean like 1800s, 1700s, and so forth. But so even while Shah Abbas forms a key narrative, it's not the only story, of course, of their origins. Just one final thing on that, of course, Armenians in Iran, while primarily associated with cities like Isfahan and Tabriz, have been spread all over the country, villages all over the country into the middle of the 20th century, and even towards around the revolution, there were still Armenian villages. I think there's still one today that's still populated by Armenians. Since modern Armenia, that territory of the South Caucasus, was lost to the Russian Empire in the 1820s or beginning of the 19th century, many Armenians moved further north. Many Armenians who in Iran, the Iranian plateau, started to resettle in what is now modern Armenia, Artsakh, Georgia, and so forth. That meant that there was a decline during that period of time, and many villages became depopulated, though there was still a strong community. In terms of in more recent political currents, Iranian Armenians played a significant part in the Iranian constitutional revolution, which we have today someone who's written a very good book on that, Professor Hudi Berberian. And during the Pahlavi era, there was more of a politically quiet period where there was tension between left and right. Those left-wing politicians or left-wing political activists who wanted to be more part of an Iran that was a social democratic or socialist state, which eventually, of course, they were not successful. And then those more conservative Armenians who were more insular in the way that they saw Armenians' place in Iran. They should focus on Armenian issues, and they were more closely tied with the church and also the split within the church in the Antelius Prelacy in the 1950s, in addition to a strong representation of the Dashnag Suchun in Armenian organizations in Iran during this time, especially after the left-wing groups like Tudeh were suppressed. Cultural developments, Armenians are quite famous in Iran. Well, famous is probably an exaggeration, but many people know about Armenians as being people who contributed to various forms of industry, particularly the car industry. And it is a stereotype of Armenians as mechanics, but also in the film industry and music. Vigen, of course, is a very well-known Iranian Armenian artist from that classical period of the development of music, and also filmmakers as well, still in Iran today. Now, and of course, sport. Antoine Temorian, more recently the captain of the Iranian national team, the Christian captain of an Islamic republic, was quite a rare thing, of course, quite a bit of a surprise, but within the context of Armenians in Iran and the Harout club, it makes sense that someone like that has come up through that system. Now, people would be familiar with the revolution, so I won't go into it. I would say that after the revolution, one of the biggest aspects of the way that people look at Armenians in Iran, most Iranians, is through the prism of the Iran-Iraq War, the contribution of Iranian Armenians during that, particularly the number who were killed as soldiers during that war. And that's a big way in how the Iranian government interacts with the community. They always talk about their contribution to the war as when they're sending best wishes for the Christmas period, the president or supreme leader will bring that up. Now, I just want to talk a bit today about more recent problems. Now, the political representation of Armenians in Iran, just briefly, there is the church, which has an unofficial role. with relations with the government. And then there are two representatives in parliament, one for the northern region, Tehran Tabriz, and one for the southern regions, Isfahan and so forth. They have a fairly ceremonial role in the forefront, but behind the scenes, they do play roles in such things for the community as helping people get their children out of military service, or if they have problems with the government or there's something going on, they usually help behind the scenes. They also have relationships with other Armenian leaders throughout the Middle East. After the explosion in Beirut in August, of course, Ara Shahverdian, the northern representative of Armenians, called his counterpart in Beirut, Hagub Bagrutuni. However, I guess the big issue today is what happened, the war with Armenia and Azerbaijan last year, and the rise in pan-Turkism and ethnic consciousness amongst Azerbaijanis who may make up a quarter of the population of Iran. Now, I don't want to exaggerate what that actually means. Of course, being an Azerbaijani speaker doesn't mean that you support the Republic of Azerbaijan or you see the Republic of Azerbaijan as your country. But there is an element of pan-Turkism and ethnic nationalism, particularly amongst people in Tabriz and Ardabil, particularly amongst those families who have more recently moved from the countryside to the city and for whom Persian is a second language, much more than those people who were raised in Tabriz or Azeri people in Tehran, who are perhaps a third of the population of Tehran. Now, it has been something that's been growing over the decades of anti-Armenian graffiti on Armenian property, particularly in Tabriz. During the first Karabakh War in the 90s, it did happen in Tehran as well. But in more recent months, of course, it's grown again. There have been open protests of Azerbaijanis chanting things such as death to Persians, death to Kurds, death to Armenians, or calling the Kurds, Armenians and Persians and Russians as the enemies of the Azerbaijani people. And of course, with a community that's shrinking, this is very worrying. And the rise in graffiti and harassment and direct challenging of the Armenian community as a symbol of Armenia is something that the community is always worried about. In particular, there's a problem with the fact that a number of Friday imams who are Azerbaijani speakers with Azerbaijani congregations threw their weight behind Azerbaijan during that war, which was a violation of Iran's neutrality in that war, a direct challenge, I guess, to the authority of Iran, which led the Iranian government to make more explicit statements in support of Azerbaijan during the war. In addition to this, well, the Iranian government is worried about growing pan-Turkism, and pan-Turkism in Iran, or Azerbaijani nationalism in Iran, is not limited to targeting Armenians, it's also targeting Kurds a great deal, particularly in cities around Urumiyeh or the area around Urumiyeh and Mohabad. There have been a number of attempts by local councils to marginalize Kurds in those areas. So it's not just about Armenians, but definitely Armenians have a lot to worry about. Now, in terms of the community's response to the war, of course, it's the same feeling of desolation that has been felt throughout many parts of the diaspora. Both the dioceses of Tehran and Isfahan condemned Pashinyan for accepting the peace agreement, the peace agreement. So, look, I've run out of time, but I'm happy to talk more in the question and answers. I'd just like to say the final thing that has come up about this is Iran has said, of course, that the border will not change with Armenia. But overall, Iran is one of the biggest losers of the geopolitical conflict outside of Armenia, of course, because now Turkey and their rivals are more powerful. But anyway, I hope I've covered enough, but I'm happy to deal with more in question and answers, but it's time to hand over to Marisa and Harout.
James, thank you so much. That was really incredible. And actually, as Huri pointed out, our first question was actually just singing your praises, that this was an excellent presentation. That's from Catherine Yasayan, and I would agree totally that you just distilled an amazing amount of information into our short little 12 minutes there, and really appreciate that. I think there's a lot to think about, especially in the response there of the most, the recent war in Artsakh. So thank you. That's deeply appreciated, and I expect there will be lots of good questions and things to think about. So we're going to sort of turn slightly geographically as we turn to our other two panelists. And the next speaker is going to be Marisa Della Gatta, who is an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Bari in Italy. She received her PhD in politics and international relations from Macquarie University in 2019 with a thesis entitled Syria in the Mirror, Politics and Belonging to Syria from Syrian Communities in Armenia and Australia. She spent 16 months working with Syrian immigrant communities in Armenia and Australia, and major cities in those countries. She publishes in English and Italian, mostly on identity and politics. Her most recent publications focus on post-Brexit EU identity, the repatriation of Syrian Armenians, and representations of the Syrian conflict. So Marisa, please take the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hori. Thank you, everyone, for making this event possible. And my presentation today will be centered on the nexus between the Armenian community of Syria and Syrian Armenian communities in diaspora. As we approach this relationship with all the methodological issues I'm sure you don't want to hear about, we face a great dilemma. Where is the homeland? Is it in Syria? Is it in the Armenian Republic? Is it in the so-called lost homeland? And this brings us back a little bit to the idea of a tripartite or even quadruple, so really a multi-layered homeland. And I'm trying to answer this question, but maybe my answer will make things more complicated. Having said that, this nexus is a crucial one for understanding the communities of Syria in a time where there is no access whatsoever to fieldwork research, and not because of COVID-19 pandemic for one, but there is a persistent inaccessibility due to security reasons, unfortunately. And given that social research on Syrian communities on the ground has never been conducted before. And so one of the few sources we have is the voices of Syrians, Armenians in this case, who left Syria most of the time after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war forcibly. And this requires a new understanding of the Syrian social mosaic model. I'm not going to talk about this that long because I don't have time, but I have to mention this because my respondents used this term. And so this means that the Armenian community, so this has become a consistent part of Syrian Armenian communities' self-understanding. And we know that this is a term which has a heavy colonial and Orientalist connotation. We know that in the colonial view, Syrian society was a crazy collection of religious and ethnic communities. Most of the time, this was linked to fragmentation, separateness, and even vulnerability of the state. Moving away from this Orientalist view, economic activities, class statuses, territorial linkages, and confessional ties created natural and artificial barriers between and among communities. But we have to wonder, are these barriers fixed? Do they necessarily produce societal antagonism in Syria? If we look at the Syrian Armenian community, the answer is no. Just to give you a little bit of background, in 1947, so we're talking about Syrian state building, so it's straight after independence, Hourani claimed that Armenians and Kurds, he added, were, I quote, alien at best and hostile at worst. to Syrian nationalism. I find these comments really problematic, not only because Hourani put together Armenians and Kurds just because of them being different to the ethnic Arab mainstream, but also because the issue is much more complicated. And these Armenian refugees who arrived in Syria in the 20s after the genocide were able to turn camps into settled and prosperous quarters by 1946. And historically speaking, we know that this is a blink of an eye, not even a quarter of a century. And so Syrian Armenians remained in Syria and continued community building, initiated with their initial settlement in Aleppo. We know that in the 50s, 25% of Aleppo's population was composed of Armenians. So it's a quarter of the city's population. We know that the Syrian conflict has dramatically changed Syrian demographic composition. And so data and numbers are unclear now. And what I find problematic about the literature on the Syrian Armenian community is their subaltern role in Syrian society as a whole. Payaslan, for one, stated that the Syrian Armenian community remained in a state of re-diasporization, experiencing the propensity towards exit. So Armenian assimilation in Syria is seen as impossible in this case because of the hostility of the host society towards Armenian integration and because of a form of resistance against assimilation. However, cultural distinctiveness is not always associated with separateness and lack of integration. As you may know, integration without assimilation is a working model in the Middle East and in Syria, especially useful for understanding the Syrian Armenian communities. It cannot be denied that from Syria's independence onwards, Syrian Armenians found a modus vivendi in Syria. And this form of reconciliation included forms of mutual political neutrality. And I'm sure that my co-panelist, Harout, will talk about this more in details. Protection of minorities in Syria was a peculiar form of restricted freedom, where association and cultural preservation is allowed, but political activism remains strictly unauthorized. Due to such mutual, pragmatic, and implicit agreement over time, political representations of the Armenian community in Syria have transformed from a threat to independence and the Arabness of the nation, dominant among Syrian nationalists between 1932 to 1946, to a national inspiration for agency after the 60s. We also know that Armenian political parties, the two main political parties, Tashnak and left wing, remain generally disinterested in Syrian domestic matters outside community politics. The two only apparently contrasting elements of involvement and preservation of Armenian identity have led to the construction of Syrian Armenian identity, which widely describes the Syrian Armenian community of Aleppo as the second motherland or the second fatherland. I'm going to quote from some of the responses I got in my fieldwork research. And because the respondents of participants in both Armenia and Australia combined together convey the formation of Syrian national belonging at its best. And I quote from one participant in Armenia. He said, nationality and citizenship are not always identical in Syria and for Armenians. The importance of ethnicity is diminishing because it's linked to the idea of the tribe. We do not say ethnic in Armenia, but we have one of the strongest identity problems. We are screaming about our nationality, but nationality does not belong to us. Syria is a home for Syrian Armenians, and they feel strong about their nationality. Elsewhere, they feel like pilgrims. Another response, Syria was a mosaic supporting each other. Syrians are first Syrians, second comes ethnic and religious affiliation. A young employee at the museum, Yerevan Museum, said, Syria is my country. I'm trying to maintain my Syrian identity throughout language and translation. Other responses include this love meaning. Syria is my love. I would like to go back to Syria because I love my country and I love my state. A young Syrian Armenian writer was less optimistic about the future, but still expressed attachment to Syria. And he said, it is impossible to talk about freedom in Syria now and in the recent future. However, I cannot deny or disclaim my Syrian identity. Both the Syrian and Armenian identity influence my writings. I follow the events in Syria. Syria is part of my life. If we have a look at the data of my surveys, similar results emerge. So if we look at the larger scale, when asked to put in an order of importance identity affiliations, the majority identified nationality as Syrian, with the remaining 32% Syrian Armenians, and only 2 respondents Armenians. When asked to put their identity on scale of importance, most participants could not indicate a preference of Syrian, Armenian, or Christian identity over one another. So just to wrap up, am I running out of time? We have a couple of minutes just to wrap up.
Yeah, you can conclude, sure.
Yes, so despite the literature on Armenian marginalization in Syria, Syrian Armenians' self-perception tells a story of Syrian identity building. And this is also demonstrated by the way that the Armenian homeland considers the Syrian Armenian community. And Armenian elites say that they are fully integrated in the host country, and they are also described as the continuation of the country, Armenia. Hence, it should not be automatically assumed that Syrian Armenians are averse to a collective attachment to Syria. So.
Marisa, thank you. Thank you so much. That's a really wonderful overview of thinking about both the attachments that Armenians have to Syria, as well as sort of looking at how the state and other communities are viewing Armenians in Syria. That's a wonderful overview of that question of these attachments that I'm looking forward to untangle a little bit more. So our final presentation, before then we open up to some questions, will come from our panelist, Harout Ekmanian. Harout is an international lawyer and attorney in New York. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, where he was also a research associate at the Program on International Law and Armed Conflict and an editor in the Harvard International Law Journal. Previously, he was an associate at Human Rights Watch. He was also a visiting scholar at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights of Columbia University and O'Donnell Global Studies Fellow at Whitman College. He's also worked as a researcher and journalist at CivilNet of the Civilitas Foundation in Yerevan, Armenia. He studied law in Aleppo, Syria, where he also wrote for community and local newspapers. Harout, I look forward to your comments. You're still muted, Harout.
Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Marisa and James, for your presentations. It was absolutely brilliant, and thank you, Huri, for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be with you here. In the next minutes, I will talk to you about the Armenian community of Aleppo and its relations with the state until the war, focusing on the Ba'ath Party era, and then I will talk a bit more on what changed in that relationship during and after the war. As we know, Armenians had centuries-old presence in the Levant, and with the establishment of the Syrian state during the first half of the 20th century, the Syrian Armenian community was reorganized and restructured largely according to the principles of the Ottoman millet system, which later was further transformed via its interaction with the modern nation state. Economic, cultural, and political changes since the 60s have altered the nature of the Armenian community. That include military coups, wars with Israel, other regional disturbances, and armed conflicts that have sometimes directly and mostly indirectly caused demographic decline in the community. Through a very complex web of decades-old alliances among sects, clans, businesses, and the security apparatus in Syria, Armenians have forged, both as a community and as individuals, relations with the authorities through the army, the security agencies, and the influential Ba'ath Party officials, after all. It is important to evaluate these networks because it can be a window to how the Armenian community can survive, transform, or maybe even cease to exist as a political group after a potential change in the political system in Syria. Armenians of Syria form a part of the larger Christian minorities in the Middle East, but in addition to that, they also have a distinct ethnic national character, which most other Christian minority groups don't. They are also a part of a bigger Armenian world and the Armenian diaspora, as mentioned by fellow panelists. Also, what I referred in the beginning to the millet system, it essentially means a form of religious and cultural autonomy, according to which the Armenians had their internal constitution, the Askain Sahmanatutun of 1863. They had their representatives and administrative bodies, all under the auspices of the church, the prelacy, and its leadership, the archbishop. After the departure of the French and the Syrian and in the independence of Syria, Armenians continued to live under this pact until the union with Egypt in 1958. In this era, under the rule of Jamal Abdel Nasser from 58 to 61, the police state and modern Arab dictatorship was fully introduced into the Syrian life, and all political parties were banned in Syria, including the Armenian political parties, who had a very active role and major influence in the Armenian community life. The largest representation of Armenians, as we know, is the ARF, the Tashnak Tutun party, where they were regarded in this period as Western agents. Therefore, many Armenian political leaders had to flee the country, otherwise they were arrested and sometimes even killed in prison. We can say that the lowest levels of relations between the Armenian community in Syria and the state was was around this time, actually, at this period. Shortly after the union with Egypt fell, after a brief period, the Ba'ath Party came into power in 1963, and the pan-Arab socialist nationalist policies ensued. This included a heavy state control on all aspects of life, including cultural, religious, educational, etc. The Armenian schools, which used to teach full Armenian curriculum before, now they had to teach only Arabic. Even the names of the Armenian schools, cultural organizations, and sports clubs were changed into Arabic as similar to all quote-unquote foreign named organizations nationwide. But when Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, he supported most of the previous Ba'ath policies, but he proved to be more pragmatic. He eased the repression on the middle class Christian minorities, as well as he softened restrictions on travel and trade. Thus, Armenian schools, Armenian schools in this period still couldn't teach Armenian history or any other Armenian curriculum, but they were allowed to teach at least 3-4 hours of Armenian language under the name of the language of the rituals, religious rituals, اللغة الطقسية. So basically, which means that they're learning this language not because of their ethnic belonging, but because it's a part of their religious practice and religious freedom. That was a special arrangement to comfort Armenians on one hand, and on the other hand, it was also to deny and prevent other ethnic minorities the same kind of rights in this case. The right to teach in national language, especially in case of Muslim Kurds who were not extended these kinds of rights. This had many explanations. Among them is that Armenians didn't pose any political or territorial claim against the state of Syria, as Kurds or even Assyrians did, thus turning Armenians into the same kind of the faithful nation of the Ottoman era, the Milleti Sadika, at the times of the Ottomans in the country, in the state of Syria at this time. The Armenian political parties were allowed to function in this period under the condition of not being seen in public, while the state officially dealt with the community through church as the official representative of the Armenian community as a religious minority. Armenian political party members, mostly ARF, the Tashnak Tutun, used to run the show through the executive bodies of the community, the prelacy, and their leaders and representatives forged relations with influential state figures and Ba'ath party figures, as well as the security and intelligence officers sometimes, and sometimes even wealthy Armenians took that role, given their position in the community's executive bodies and their influence. Eventually, a complex web of relations between Armenian community leaders and regime representatives started to emerge. This state of affairs continued more or less in the same shape during after Bashar al-Assad took power, and it continued until the Syrian revolt in 2011. One major difference that was started to become noticed after Bashar took power is that the ruling elite increasingly started to cave into Islamist pressure, which were the Islamist pressure was basically trying to impose their will in many cases, also by challenging the quote unquote the privileges enjoyed by the Christian minorities, including Armenians. So, for example, as the civil courts in Syria formally affirmed the recommendations that was given to them by the community religious councils in cases of family status issues, inheritance, divorce, etc., and gave the corresponding verdict that with whatever the church bodies say. But this was actually a working guideline for all judges and courts, a directive rather than a law. But later, judges, mostly Sunni judges, started to disregard this practice and impose judgments based on the more generally applied Syrian law, the Syrian family status law, which is basically derived from the Sharia. And then afterwards, the state had to adopt the law actually for the family status law of the Catholic communities, for the Orthodox communities, for the Armenian communities, in order to make that enshrined in law and not to leave room to maneuver for the judges. After the Syrian uprising in March 2011, the community leadership didn't declare any position or made statements. Although many community members declared unconditional support to the president and the authorities, the perceived top community leader, who's the prelate, became the only religious leader among all the Christian sects in Syria who never showed up on TV actually, or media, or in support of the regime. Afterwards, when the uprising turned more violent and when bombing and armed clashes reached the city of Aleppo in 2012, where most of the Armenians of Syria live, the community had to fend for itself. And groups of Armenian guards were tasked to defend the Armenian residential areas. No Christian minority supported the opposition, but for Armenians, there were extra reasons. The expatriate Syrian opposition was largely seen as a Turkish-backed and Turkish-controlled regime change project, which was mostly motivated by religious fanaticism, and they only paid lip service to democracy, freedom, and diversity in order to appease Western donors and political supporters. This was how it was seen, for that matter, and later it proved to be true in many instances. All these have pushed the Syrian Armenians into closer cooperation with the state on all levels, especially on the political and security fronts. They were already trusted partners to the state, but now even more than that, which this could have its good and bad consequences, of course. For example, although it is an unwritten rule that an Armenian candidate from Aleppo must always win a seat, I would put it on quotes because it's Syria and you know what elections mean there. It must always win a seat in the parliament. But in the parliamentary elections in May 2012, the Armenian candidate who was running for his third term, Sumbul Sumbulyan, lost to another candidate, which was a candidate from a rural tribe for almost, which represented a 30,000 people tribe. Damascus compensated Armenians with an Armenian minister in Nazir. So they lost the parliamentary seat, but they got a minister instead. But what was behind losing that seat was that Armenians were already guaranteed faithful, and they were always in support and in support of the state, and their cooperation was always a guaranteed fact. So Damascus wanted to keep that big tribe on its side by giving them that seat in the expense of the Armenians. So that was one of the side effects of being too faithful, probably. However, in the following elections, Armenians were compensated for their faithfulness with not just one, but 3 members of parliament. Although their numbers in the country have fallen even below the third of what it used to be before the war, that of course also could be explained as a demonstration by the state to show to the international community the large representation given to minorities under the Assad rule, in contrast to the Islamist-dominated opposition that the West have been supporting to gain power in Syria. Before the Assad came to power, the Assad father and the son, the community almost always survived political instabilities and coups that were sometimes followed by days of chaos and until the restoration of law and order. The community had an experience of going through different dynamics and temporary shocks that lasted for very short periods. Their trust on the state's ability to maintain the security and stability was very high, that even the worst case scenario that they could imagine didn't go beyond having to organize a self-defense for a few hours or days of chaos until the state takes back the control and punishes the rioters. No one, in fact, could imagine a period of prolonged chaos spanning for over a decade. To wrap up, just quickly, previously the community relied on its relationship with the state for its security and protection, but the war proved the limits of the state and its abilities too. This caught Armenians off guard, but frankly, there were not too many alternatives. In the near future, no sharp changes in the community situation, in the situation of the community and its relationship with the state could be expected, frankly, unless there is some form of a major political change in the country. But on the longer term, the Syrian community's fate could be similar to something in between what the situation of Iraq's community is and the Egyptian one. Which means that it would lose, if not already lost, perhaps its position as in the Armenian world as the Mair Kavut, the mother diaspora community, which raised generations of community organizers, clerics, teachers, and leaders for the entire diaspora. But it will still be a compact community like Egypt that would guard whatever Armenian heritage, monuments, churches, cemeteries that is left in the country. And I want to stop here and leave room for the questions.
Harout, thank you so much. That was a really tour de force of a sort of overview of state community relations, both over time, with a really good look at the most recent moment and the changes since the Syrian uprising and war. So thank you for that. I think we've got a lot to work with. Before this evening, I had sort of identified a few themes. There's a whole lot more ideas and questions that I think connect what we've got already on the table. There's a few questions from our audience already. I will have time for that in a little bit, but we're going to start kind of between the other panelists that are here. But please do keep them coming. I'm looking at them. I will try to get to many of those audience questions, although no promises on all of them. But to start with, I think there's a lot of really wonderful threads that we can pull at. But I want to maybe start kind of big, because one of the things that's really foundational for both of these communities, it seems like, is the story of migration. And then now, of course, the present moment of emigration, right? So there's this sort of dual movement into and out of these two countries. And, James, you talked about how there's a sort of foundational idea of the Iranian community as sort of starting from, the Shah Abbas to the point that you have to, if you're not a Shah Abbas Armenian, you have to distinguish yourself. So there's this sort of, foundational moment of migration in, but now, of course, the numbers are much smaller. In Syria, of course, we have Aleppo as a kind of, old community. But at the same time, of course, post-genocide, these numbers, swell to the point where, Marisa, I didn't know this number, that a quarter of the, population of the city in the 50s was Armenian. So again, we have this kind of, a moment of it being constituted by a kind of migration in. Harout, you mentioned, the idea of the Mair Kavut, right? The idea that this is the sort of the life-giving, diaspora community. But diaspora community, right? So both of these communities are sort of constituted by their moments of migration in, and now both of them are at a sort of crisis point in terms of numbers with migration outward. And I just kind of want to highlight that, and I want our other panelists also. We've seen already in Lebanon, and we will see in Turkey. These questions of kind of the movements in and out, and what that means. I've already got a question. About sort of the stability of these communities in the Middle East. So that's a sort of broad way of drawing it together, maybe. But I wonder if our other panelists could maybe help us think about this sort of, these foundational moments of migration in, and what that means then that we are seeing such a migration out right now, and where might that take us for these communities that are seen as so important, right? So foundational to the diaspora everywhere. So I'll ask if some of the other panelists want to comment on this idea of kind of our movements in and out, and how that relates to such a centrality for these Middle Eastern Armenian communities, for the diaspora. I know it's a big way of putting it, but either those who have already spoken or our Lebanon or Harout, if you've got some thoughts as well.
Chris, as people are thinking about this, I'd like to remind attendees that questions have to be put through Q&A, and if you raise your hand, we can't take your question that way. You would have to type it into the Q&A. I noticed that some people have raised their hand. Sorry for the.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can't see those raised hands. I can only see the questions because I'm not a host. So thank you. Good. Yeah, it's Olin.
No, that's thank you, all of you, for your presentations, and Chris for bringing us together. About the moment of leaving, right? It's interesting because all of these communities, from what I know and I'm learning tonight, they are their original points or their arrival points are different, but there's a homogenization that's actually happening in their leaving, right? Because people that have come at different times are actually leaving at the same time. Right? I wondered how that may connect to tensions actually within the community that must already exist, that three of you didn't talk too much about. I felt like actually, James, you hinted at it a little bit with saying, no, we are, not these Armenians, we're those Armenians, right? But there has to, I'm assuming there's more behind this. I didn't know about this, so I would be really curious to know a little bit more. And I'm assuming this also must exist vis-a-vis like class issues between just Damascus and Aleppo, because that tension already exists on the larger perspective, but I would assume it also exists even amongst Armenians as well. So I wanted to know a little bit more about that. And then does that change when you leave? Because that, that difference is no longer there, or it's pushed aside at least momentarily or possibly permanently. So I just I was sort of wondering about that as you were talking, and a little bit related to what Chris is asking.
Should I, I'm happy to start on this one, talking about if we're going to, unless Chris, you want to move on and
no, I think that's great. Solon, thank you for sort of putting a finer point on a broad question that I raised. And I'd love to hear what tonight's panelists would say to those specific things. Yeah.
Thanks, Solon. It's hard to give an explanation of all the different divisions within within a minute or so. But the divisions are regional. Even in Tehran, the difference between what they call Nadir Shah Abbas, which is now Mirzaya, Shirazi, and Farahani Street in the northern center of Tehran, which is where the real Tehran Armenians are from. And then now what is the heart of the community, the suburbs of Narmak and Majidiyeh, which are the Gyugatsiner, as in the people who had come from central Iranian villages to Tehran with the intention of moving to Soviet Armenia in the 40s, but the border was closed and they were stuck there. And so they ended up in these suburbs. And that tension is expressed linguistically as well, the use of different dialects, even amongst generations born in Tehran, as a way of differentiating each other. But politically, there's still divisions. The Alek newspaper, which is the main Armenian newspaper, which is a Tashnag affiliate, has a long-going dispute with Araks, which is a left-wing newspaper, which is still surviving in Tehran. Even last year, essentially Araks is constantly attacking the leadership of the Armenian community, both the autonomous leadership, which I should have linked in with what Marisa and Harout are talking about. Like in Syria, the Armenian community is self-governing, and also it has its own law courts on family law. So Araks is constantly criticizing them. Last year it was all of these members have COVID and the Armenian community is covering it up, and then Alex responding saying Araks we don't know where they got their information from, all that sort of stuff. But in terms of migration, I have noticed it a bit, but it really depends on people's circumstances. Again, class. People who migrate, for instance, using the refugee method of going to Vienna, staying for 6 months and then moving to the United States, have a different experience than those who move to Armenia and those who end up in Australia, who often have come on highly skilled visas. Now, in terms of the Armenian identity, In Australia, at least, Iranian Armenians have this reputation of being more educated and a little bit posh and stuck up. They don't, the rest of the community, stuck up's not really a polite word to use, but the rest of the community sees them as a kind of a community apart. But of course, their own internal divisions would exist. And then also the difference between when people migrated, 80s during the war and more recently, different sort of people. But really, Armenians are migrating from Iran for the same reason that other Iranians are. So there isn't, there is a level of solidarity on that, but at the same time, the feeling of tensions in the society, certain things do unite them. Pan-Turkism, the fear of Pan-Turkism, of course, is now current. In the last couple of years with the rise of ISIS, the fear of religious difference and sectarianism causing problems for the community was another one. So they tend to come together on certain issues, but I hope I kind of answered your question. I haven't seen Iranian Armenian organizations in the diaspora that have been specifically regionally focused. But one last thing I will say, in Iran, Jukhsiner, the New Jolfa Armenians, are seen as a world apart from Tehran Armenians, to the point where Tehran Armenians find it very difficult to live in Isfahan because the community is compact, unlike Tehran where they're a bit more spread out. And they also find themselves being called Odar by Jukhsiner, who are, I'm not sure the best way to describe it because they were even closed when it came to me in Isfahan. So I didn't have that much access to them, but they almost seem to think they're preserving themselves as best as possible. And these Tehran Armenians are a little bit more, I guess, assimilated. I'm not sure exactly if that's their view. That's the sense I get. One final thing is the idea of double diaspora, which I think David Wax wrote about with Sephardic Jews in the Mediterranean and then moving further. I get the sense that there is a little bit of that double diaspora amongst Syrian Armenians, Lebanese Armenians, Iranian Armenians. When they move anywhere, they maintain that memory and connection, sometimes as a material form and sometimes in other ways. And sometimes it's in terms of dialect. Even in Gorgan, in Iran, there's a village that no longer exists, but their descendants, they still try to use their Western Armenian dialect because they were a post-genocide community that settled in Iran. So that type of behavior, or that type of attempts to hold on to that separate identity is still there, or that uniqueness is still there. Hopefully that answers some of what you were needing to ask.
Thanks, James. Marisa or Harout, do you want to take up this sort of question of class or other tension within the community, and then if we sort of continue to see that post-emigration?
Yes, if I may jump in. So thank you, James, for mentioning this dual diaspora. In fact, I looked at this kind of diaspora interviewing and doing survey research with Syrian Armenians who repatriated, so to speak, to Armenia after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. And I keep wondering, what would they, if they were still in Syria, what would they have told me? Because, so as you said, Chris, this idea of emigration, but in a sense repatriating to the homeland, made them reconsider their attachments to Syria. And so this is really a constitutive element of their expressions and also their self-understanding. And so also, we're talking about a really compact community, but also this going from, let's say, a really high class status most of the time. We know that the Syrian Armenian community of Aleppo was well established and prosperous. And so moving from that class status to an inferior one also made them reconsider also their political views, in a sense, because we know that elites were really loyal to the regime, but moving away from that elite kind of status made them reconsider the loyalty. And so this is really a complex question to answer. And we also know that in Syria, we have to distinguish between genocide generated Armenian communities who were established in Aleppo, but we also know that there were a couple of Armenian enclaves in northern Syria, which were Arabized Armenians, so well before the genocide. And so they don't even speak Armenian anymore, but they tend to, in a sense, also there is this, after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, solidarity is a big component. And so they kind of came together as a compact community also because of this.
Chris?
Thank you, Marisa. Harout, do you want to add there?
Yeah, actually, James pointed out to a very peculiar point about the Juhtis and Tehran Armenians, which I kind of find a similar parallel in Syria, but not exactly for the same reasons or the same context. For example, there was always, if you look at the map from the Jazeera region, then to Aleppo and the coast and Lebanon, there was always a constant wave of movement coming from the east to the west. At some point in the early 2000s in Aleppo, like almost more than half of the community were either born or their parents were born in the Jazeera region. And the situation in Lebanon is probably similar because maybe 1/3 of the community was either from Aleppo or their parents were born in Aleppo. There was constant move from one place to the other. And this move was also accompanied by a lot of social understandings, different understandings. For example, in Aleppo, which was the center of the Armenian community in Syria, there was always a notion that the Aleppo Armenians saw themselves as superior to the regions, even from the capital, from Damascus, which was somehow seen as subject to the leadership and command from the center, which was Aleppo. This was something that kind of resembles what was between Tehran and Juhti and other places, but probably in a much different context that I wanted to draw attention to. And the concept of elitism that Marisa was mentioning, I want to underline here that in relation to that there was nothing that was given by the state. There was no positive action on their part that bestowed on Armenians any elite status, but it was simply, let's put it this way, they were left alone in a country where the state controls everything. So that was probably, quote unquote, you can say it, elite privilege probably for the Armenians.
Thank you, Harout. I want to ask Harout a little bit here about this, because actually I know that, with Turkish Armenians, this question of sort of, one class is a sort of interesting one, but, the place of Bolis and the sort of diaspora imagination is another one that could be related to this idea of Aleppo and the Markarut. So I think that maybe Istanbul and Turkey can help us think a little bit about this in and out migration. And I would just add quickly that there was a question from the audience about, should Armenia encourage repatriation? And we've talked a little bit about that. Marisa sort of mentioned the repatriation question. So I know that also comes up in discourse about Turkish Armenians. So maybe Harout, I can toss you all of those things at once there if you want to take on some of that for us.
Sure. Thanks for the questions. That's a bit too much, so I'll try to be short. Yeah, Bolis is also a place where which has been a place for in-migration of Armenians and then out-migration of Armenians from Bolis to elsewhere. The Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople was established in 1461. And then around it, there was a growing community. After the genocide and then after the establishment of the Turkish Republic, Turkey, which was like another Markaut, perhaps even a more important one historically speaking. That's where the Western Armenian was mostly formulated or polished and growing and outcoming Armenian Western Armenian literature and so on before the genocide. But anyway, that Markaut and that old Bolsa Hayutun, that old Bolsa Armenians, Istanbul Armenian community, started to lose some numbers as some people started to migrate to the US, to Canada, to Europe, mainly to France. There's a quite large community of Istanbulite Armenians in France. But at the same time, in parallel, there were some other Armenians from within Turkey, from the eastern parts of Turkey, who would during each and every decade after the 30s, during the 30s, 40s, even until the 80s, 90s, there have been some last villages of Christian Armenians in Sassoon, for instance, who have left their villages in Sassoon and who have come to Istanbul in the 80s. And so these people would come and would somehow refill, we could say, the Istanbulite Armenian community in terms of numbers, but they were quite different. And there were of course these tensions in terms of class, but also in terms of language, because most of the people coming from the Kavars, that's what the Bolsahais would call those areas, those regions. So Kavars, and they would call these people Kavarsis. And so there was this tension between the Bolsahais and the Kavarsis. And so there was also issues of language, because the Kavarsis would oftentimes not know Armenian. They would be Turkish speaking, whereas old Bolsahai would be Armenian speaking, and so on and so on. And eventually the whole balance changed. And now in current day Bolsahai Hayutun, most of them are Kavarsi Armenians, whose parents are born in Kavar, in Malatya, in Sepastia, in Sassoon, in Diyarbakir, and so on and so on and so on. And so that's one thing. But now there's a new phenomenon that resembles this Kavarsi versus Bolsahai thing. And in this case, it's a new wave of migration, this time from from even far. That's Armenia, that's the Republic of Armenia. Since the early 1990s, after the independence of Armenia, Armenians from Armenia have started in small numbers to migrate to Istanbul. And so now they are in the position of the Kavarsi, in some class issues, them being migrant workers, oftentimes working within the homes, within the apartments of Bolsahais, or of Kavarsi Bolsahais, who are nowadays almost Bolsahais anymore. That boundary has somehow lost its significance, but there's this new boundary between Hayastansis and Bolsahais, or Istanbuli Hayar. And so there are these waves, and then of course, coming back to what Solin said, what happens when they leave? I have not studied the diasporic Bolsahai communities in France or in the US and so on, but I would assume that again those differences would to some extent fade out, and they would be welcomed, or not really welcomed, being Armenians from Turkey, in the Armenian diasporic communities in Europe and the US as Turkahais. again, I've heard that they are even at times marginalized within the Armenian diasporic communities for being Turkahais. And so there at that point, it's probably not really relevant for older, U.S. Armenians or European Armenians, whether they are old Bolsahais or whether they are, Sepastahais who have first moved to Istanbul and then have their Turkahais period. Just to comment very quickly on the other issue about whether they should go to Armenia, whether it should be encouraged. They should be encouraged to go to Armenia. That's quite, there's a debate, there has been a debate in the Armenian world about the Bolsahai community, whether they constitute a diaspora or not. And there has been some reaction from the Bolsahai community, from within. For instance, a decade ago or so, the minister of the diaspora of Armenia had organized something and had invited also representatives from Bolis, and one of the representatives had openly said that we do not consider ourselves to be a diaspora, and that has its reasons. I might leave that to our panel about Turkey, because that's quite long. But and here I'll end it. There is a very recent movement from Istanbul to Armenia as well. That's very small. We're talking about a very small number of people, but that's also a phenomenon, especially what concerns applying to the Armenian citizenship. So more and more people, Armenians of Istanbul, have to citizens, especially after the further deterioration of the political climate in Turkey, starting from 2013, 14, 15, especially after the attempt of coup d'etat in 2016, people started to look for other ways, for a plan B, as they would say, and that's what what I'm researching currently with Dr. Aykut Öztürk, my colleague from Turkey and from UCL London. So yeah, I'll end this here.
Thank you, Harout. That was really helpful for some of our bigger themes here. I appreciate that. Joanne, I want to give you a chance to hop in here, but if you don't mind, I might ask your help in directing us to one of the other themes that we sort of have gotten, both coming from the questions and that I identified, which is that we've seen both a lot about sort of community-state relation and also relations with different communities. And there's a couple questions specifically about Kurds, Armenians and Kurds. But I actually think maybe Lebanon would be a really good place to help us think about these sort of community relations between Armenians and other communities, right? So not necessarily Armenians in relation to the states of these different countries, but the sort of the mix of all the different communities. And our panelists have talked about that, but maybe Joanne, with your sort of expertise as well, you can help us think about this question of Armenians in relation to the other communities.
Sure. Maybe my way of answering that, or rather bringing it into discussion, will just be to talk about it through the place where I did most of my field work, which was a very working class kind of suburb of Beirut called Burj Hamud, which maybe some of our attendees are familiar with. It's an interesting place to think about this question, because while it was urbanized, so to speak, and became a municipality really after, the French made it officials and also some Lebanese officials who at the time wanted to permanently settle Armenians in the country. This is as Lebanon was becoming a state. Burj Hamud became this place where permanent housing was built and people were kind of moving out of the camps and into this neighborhood where they, still is a majority Armenian neighborhood, despite the decline in numbers of Armenians in the country. And again, there's been no official census in Lebanon since 1932, so we don't really have any exact numbers, but it's pretty clear from many people I've talked to and other informal sort of surveys that there has been out-migration out of Lebanon, Armenian out-migration rather. So anyway, this neighborhood, while it was originally urbanized, built to sort of permanently house, settle Armenians in the country, it's always really been a hub for migration within the country, rural to urban migration of other Lebanese, members of other Lebanese communities. Namely, there's a pretty large population of Maronites and has been, and also Shia, Lebanese Shia, particularly from smaller towns in the south, who started migrating to the city due to conflict and for economic reasons over a number of years. And the situation in Bush Hamud, of course, gets complicated during the war, and I won't get into the whole story of what happened then. But it really has been, for most of its history in the 20th century, and even after the war, has been a pretty diverse place. So you have not just a kind of dynamic working class community where members of different Lebanese sects, Christian and Muslim, broadly speaking, live kind of in proximity, and at least one or two of the Armenian clinics and social welfare centers that I'm familiar with also treat members of really any community who comes in. That's part of their mandate. There are ways in which that presence feels really natural to the neighborhood, has kind of always been that way, and is just part of the fabric of this very working class kind of suburb. In ways that differ a lot, even just when you cross into Beirut, because you're then in the sort of eastern neighborhoods of Beirut. They're a lot more homogenous, actually. So Bush Hamud is a place where people of different, sectarian communities in Lebanon, religious communities, but also migrants from all over the world, not just from Syria, but really from Ethiopia, from Sri Lanka, from elsewhere in Southeast Asia. This is a place where lots of, people of lower income, of working class people kind of tend to live and work. So in that sense, it's a really interesting place to think about this question. And, I write about this a lot in my book, that there's ways in which the very system in Lebanon, which kind of has for a long time forced people to seek recourse for social welfare and all kinds of services and infrastructures through, quote unquote, their communities. There's a way in which that creates forms of exclusion and difference, but there's also, because Bush Hamud is like I said, a working class space, a low income space, a very densely populated community where people live and work kind of side by side, even if they're school, the flip side of that is schools are still quite separate. Armenians tend to send their kids to Armenian schools, and that's still happening. So it's not to say there's this total integration, maybe along the lines of American multiculturalism or something like that, but rather that there is this kind of acknowledgement or side-by proximity, and at times collaboration and working together that I think is unique in that space, and that I find remarkable for Lebanon, post-war Lebanon, but also I think to me says something about the capacity for Armenian communities there, at least working class, members of the working class, who, according to Suad Joseph's research in the 70s, really were working in informal networks of aid and mutual aid with people of other communities. And it really was actually a moment after, right at the beginning of the Civil War, where those relationships were really infringed upon by the sectarian parties, who especially wanted to make sure that informal women's lending networks and things like that were formalized through banking co-ops and things like that. So I write a little bit about this on my book, and I draw from that research. But it's interesting to me as one example where class really is another factor that is often, at least when thinking about the Middle East, is often really under-theorized and de-emphasized. And I think that, in that sense, what you find in Bush Hamud is very different from what you find in other Armenian communities in the greater Beirut area, and even compared to places like Anja, right? So I look for these aspects of, differentiation and difference, and the routing through these different cultural and sectarian organizations. And yet there is something about this neighborhood where people of various communities have always lived and worked and even collaborated on things together. So I guess it doesn't really answer the question, but just kind of complicates the idea of, there being these monolithic communities that are like bowling balls bumping against each other that don't really intersect. But at least even in the case of Lebanon, where everything is so routed through sectarian political parties and forms of representation, that's not really how everyday life kind of works in a lot of places.
Thank you, Jan. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that you connected this question of sort of the communities in relation to each other to our earlier conversation we were having about class, right? That's one way of thinking maybe about these communities together and separately. So thank you. We're sort of fast barreling to our hour and a half. I want to give, if other folks want to have, a last minute sort of on this last idea of the community in relation to each other, especially thinking about maybe Kurds or Pan-Turkism. I think that's okay if we go a tiny bit, I suppose. But there's a couple quick questions I want to direct to James while I give the other panelists the option of thinking about if they want to take on Pan-Turkism and Kurds and intercommunal questions here. So James, I've got one question about the number 20,000 Armenians in Iran today, and if we have any sort of reference for that. And then Catherine just nicely wants to know how long you've been doing this research, because you're sort of so deeply knowledgeable about the Armenians in Iran. So your research time and that 20,000 number, while the others think about their possible conclusions.
Okay, I'll just quickly answer those. Thank you, Catherine. I started in 2008. And I've been in Iran 3 times, and it's one of these situations that once you go, you can't get rid of it. It stays with you. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why I'm always thinking about it and I'm always involved in it. But yeah, I had to learn Armenian, of course, and Persian to get. I learned Western Armenian because I live in Australia, and it actually one of the things talking about Beirut. I stayed in Zalqa next to Borj Hamoud. Going into a coffee shop and hearing Western Armenian, I'm so used to only hearing Eastern Armenian. That was quite a great experience. But so yeah, Catherine, that's how long I've been working on it. In terms of the number 20,000, that comes from people in the community themselves. So it's partially anecdotal and partially not. So Robert Safarian, who you may have heard of, he's a journalist, Armenian journalist from Iran. He also is a film critic. He's a judge in the Apricot Film Festival in Armenia as well. He has come to this number. He talks about this number as being based on school enrollments. So he looks at the school enrollments in Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, and other areas, and compares them to how they were in 1979. And at his estimate, the community was 150,000 in 1979, and based on the level in school enrollments, he's concluded that it's about 20,000. This is 5 years ago. He was concluding it was 20,000. So that's where he came to the number. Now, the official census says it's higher. The community, I think, officially, community meaning the church and the representatives of the community, say between 40 and 80,000. But there's a number of problems. Firstly, in the census, a lot of Iranians, as a means of expressing opposition to the state, list their religion as Christian. And Christian doesn't differentiate between a Syrian or Armenian in the Iranian census. So there's that. And so that comes up as 120,000, which is quite large. But also, the community has to justify the reason why it has 2 members of parliament, which is constitutionally, it has to be, I think, 50,000 people or something. So that's another reason why they kind of keep a bigger number. But sometimes I also think that this number of 20,000 relates to a general feeling of pessimism about the future of the community and the level of immigration. So there may be, to some extent, it's not an exaggeration, but it's an undercounting because people are so pessimistic about the future of Armenians in Iran. But just finally, the only person who's tried to systematically look at it that I've spoken to was Robert Safarian, and he used schools as his way of gauging that. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, James. That's very clear. I appreciate that. So I know we're at that moment, but I want to give, my last thing is simply that I'm going to say that I think there's so many more questions. I'm glad we have one more session. I wish we had more, because I think this group could talk for a very long time about really interesting things. And I'm deeply appreciative of that. But I want to then just repose one last time if folks want to take on this idea of, the question of sort of intercommunal relations, especially if that has to do with Kurds, and if Pan-Turkism has changed that. And if anyone takes that up, I open that up, but otherwise I'll be done with my talking for the evening.
I might actually just say something really quickly, if we have a minute. I wonder to what extent tension between communities is also an articulation of anger or annoyance or any type of problems with the government, for example. So I'm not so convinced, that suddenly people in northern Iran are, feeling their Azeri roots and articulating anti-Armenianness in that fashion. And I know, James, that's not what you were saying, right? But I'm just thinking also with regards to anti-Armenian violence and harassment in Lebanon, I think that some of it could be geared towards Armenians, absolutely, and I think that's sincere. But at the same time, I think it could also be an articulation of other types of grievances that are done in that language, and that is more able at this moment. And I think that's maybe something we can also talk about, because I imagine that can also occur in Turkey as well. So it's something maybe we can also talk about in the future, but I don't want to, I think we should be wary of focusing on that as well.
On that
I didn't mean to end it there, but I just wanted to throw it in. I'm sorry.
I think that's a great way to end it, because I think it will take us to the next virtual salon, where I think we will probably pick up this theme again. So thank you very much to all the panelists, especially to the presenters, and to Chris for doing such a wonderful job in moderating. To the attendees with all of their questions, and we did it in an hour and a half. We probably could continue to speak, but we'd probably get tired. And the attendees are getting fewer as we go longer, so they're getting tired. But thank you again. Before everyone leaves, I just want to remind you that our next virtual salon is again on a Friday at the same time, 12 noon Pacific time, April 23rd. But before that, next month on March, on Thursday, on the 11th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, we will have a panel on Armenia's Velvet, A Voice and Vision in an Uncertain World panel on the continuing political turmoil in Armenia. So we hope you'll join us for both of those. You can get news from us through our website, through our newsletter, by signing up through our website, and also through our Facebook site. And you will see a recording of this very virtual salon, including the first one, on our YouTube channel. So please join us again. And thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.